Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. This is Kim Brown, and I will be your host for today. We do still have a few people signing in, so we'll give them another minute to get going on the sign-in. And while we're waiting for the webinar to actually get started, just so you know, in the handouts area of your screen, and you'll find that by looking at the upper right-hand part of your screen, you'll see an orange box with an arrow inside of it. If you click on that, it will open a dashboard for you, and one of the items in the dashboard should say handouts. The PowerPoint slideshow, a PDF version of it, is posted in there in case you're interested in having the slides printed off or downloaded before we begin the presentation today. So again, we'll just give one more minute while folks continue to sign in to the webinar, and then we will get started. Okay, it looks like the logging in has slowed down, so I will go ahead and get the webinar going. Welcome, everyone. I'm Kim Brown with the Rural Institute for Inclusive Communities, Transition and Employment Projects, and I'll be your moderator for today. This webinar is sponsored by Children's Special Health Services and the Montana Deaf-Blind Project, and is funded in whole or in part under contracts with the Montana Department of Public Health and Human Services and the U.S. Department of Education Office of Special Education Programs. The statements shared in the presentation do not necessarily reflect the opinion of the departments. All attendees are currently muted. This helps cut down on background noise so that we can all hear the presenter. If you want to ask the presenter a question or make a comment, please type your question or comment into the chat box. And please note that only you, the moderator, myself, and the presenter will be able to see what you have typed into the chat box. If you don't see that chat box or the question box in front of you, look at the upper right-hand area of your computer screen. You should see an orange box with a white arrow inside of it. If you click on that, it should open a dashboard, and one of the options will be chat or questions, and that's where you can type in your question or your comment for our presenter. For those of you who requested Montana Office of Public Instruction renewal units when you registered, those will be emailed to you after the webinar. It can take a couple of weeks for us to get those sent out. And please note that you must have pre-registered in order to receive the OPI credit. Unfortunately, we are currently unable to issue other kinds of attendance documentation. Today's session is being audio taped for the Transition and Employment Project's Resource Library. The recording for today's webinar will be posted to the Transition and Employment Training Archives page, and I will put the URL or website address for that page in the chat box in just a few minutes. We'll get that posted as soon as possible. It can take about a week for us to get the recording loaded. And please note that the slides for today's session are available for download in the handouts area on your screen. Again, if you don't see the handouts area on your screen, look to the upper right-hand area of your computer screen, and you should see an orange box with a white arrow in it. If you click on that, it should open a dialog box or a menu, and one of the options on there should be handouts, and the slides for today's session are available on there. When you log out of the webinar today, a survey will pop up, and we do ask that you please take the time to answer the questions. I think we only have 8 or so of them on there, but we do read through all of the surveys, and we use the feedback that you provide in order to determine topics for future webinars and also to try to continually improve the training that we offer. So again, when that survey pops up, please do take a few minutes to complete it. With that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speaker for today. I feel very fortunate that we have Ellen Condon as our presenter. Ellen is the director of the Transition and Employment Projects and the Montana Deaf-Blind Project at the University of Montana's Rural Institute for Inclusive Communities, where she has worked since 1996 on transition and employment for youth with significant disabilities. Ellen is also a consultant with Mark Gold and Associates, and she serves as a subject matter expert for the Office of Disability Employment Policy at the U.S. Department of Labor on the Employment First State Leadership Mentor Project. Ellen has worked in the field of developmental disabilities since 1986. Prior to coming to Montana, her experiences included hands-on service delivery, program development, and program management in community residential and supported employment programs. She received her master's degree in special education from Boston College in 1990 after completing coursework in transition and supported employment. At the Rural Institute, she has served as the principal investigator and project director for numerous federal and state-funded grants. Ellen provides technical assistance, training, and on-site support to schools, agencies, and individuals, and families as well, predominantly in the areas of employment, transition, and Social Security work incentives. She lectures and consults with schools and adult service agencies, and she and her staff have produced numerous publications on transition issues and employment. And with that, I will turn it over to Ellen, and I'll change it to have you as the presenter. Thank you very much, Ellen, and take it away.
Hi, everybody. Let me just get my screen set up. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. This is going to be a two-part webinar, and Melissa Dadman, my co-worker on the Deafblind Project, is going to be joining us in April for this part two. It's spring break, so she's hanging out in the Utah desert right now. But for many of you, I just kind of scrolled through the attendees list. Many of you are familiar to the work we've done around transition and have attended various trainings before. What we want to talk about in this two-part webinar is how things have really changed nationally. We have new legislation in place that really impacts transition. And if you're not feeling those changes and impacts yet, you will be. So part of what we're looking at today is what's new nationally, how does that impact schools and students in transition, and what do we need to do differently to achieve good outcomes, meaning that students leave school with a full adult life. We have a lot of opportunities now to collaborate cross agencies between voc rehab and schools, and we have the possibility of employment for all students, even students with the most significant disabilities. However, that means us doing things a little differently to ensure that we are taking part and accessing these opportunities for everybody. So, you know, I like this slide because I think it gets us thinking about, you know, instead of looking at the transition IEP form, let's look at what does that really mean? Like if we did a great job of supporting a student to transition from high school to adult life, ideally their daytimer page for the day after high school would look full. It would look like one of our daytimer pages, ideally, where we get up at a certain time, we have a routine, we do things at home, we get to work or whatever we're doing for the day, and we pretty much know what we're doing for a full 8 to 10 to 12 hours. And so when we're thinking about what are our post-school outcomes or post-secondary outcomes for students with disabilities, the ideal would be that they have a job to go to when they exit. There's a home where they want to live and they get to live with people of their choice and do things that they'd like to do at their house and in their community, and that they have friends. Part of the challenge of transition is figuring out, okay, what outcomes do we shoot for each student? What skills do we develop between now and when they exit school? And if those students have long-term or ongoing support needs, what kind of agencies are available to provide those support needs? And how do we connect students and families to those agencies before there's a cliff and they no longer go to school? So some of the resources that I'm going to share with you this morning are, or this afternoon actually, are information from the Advisory Committee to increase competitive and integrated employment for individuals with developmental disabilities. And basically the law that set up this committee was WIOA, or the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, which was passed in 2014, and a lot of that law is just still getting put into place in terms of services and strategies across all states, not just our state. But part of what this advisory committee found was that, you know, once again, and this isn't new, but once again, like, there's poor adult employment outcomes. And young adults with disabilities are still living in poverty. And what they basically are indicating is causing this is that not all students have enough work experiences while they're in high school that actually prepare them for real work, for real wages in the community. And when I say competitive integrated employment, how that's defined is that you're working for real wages in the community, minimum or prevailing wage. There's no sub-minimum wage allowed. It's in the community alongside other people without disabilities, with the same access to integration as anybody else in that type of work, and with the opportunities for benefits and advancement. So that's what they're looking at as the outcome from transition services for all students with disabilities. We're setting the bar a lot higher now with the influence of WIOA. But what they're saying is that we're not getting these outcomes. Also, services like maybe school and voc rehab, mental health and developmental disabilities, those services, a kid may be getting services from all those entities, but they tend to be separate, not working together. With WIOA, we have the opportunity to work more collaboratively, to share resources, and attempt to get better outcomes for students so that they leave school with a paid job, with supports in place, so that they can maintain that job. Another barrier that they cited was that students who need assistive technology don't always have access to that technology. So how do we change some of that? So if somebody needs technology to increase their access to their workplace or to their home or to their community, how are we connecting up students and families with people that can share information about technology that's right for that student? How do we ensure that that student understands how to use that technology and is competent with that technology so that when they do exit high school, they're using it efficiently and proficiently? Another deficit area is, are we getting information to families? Do all families have enough information about what transition is, what their role for preparing their son or daughter in transition is? Who are the agencies that can assist them? And what do you do? Like, how do you connect with voc rehab? When do you connect with voc rehab? When do you connect with developmental disability services? And what do you do in the meantime if you're waiting for services? And the final area that the advisory committee shed light on is that not all staff are as effective and competent in competitive integrated employment strategies as they would need to be to place students with the most significant disabilities in paid work before they exit. And once again, the report showed that work experience and paid community employment, or competitive integrated employment in high school, are both correlated with successful post-school employment. So if you have a paid job while you're in high school, you are far more likely to work after you exit high school. The other factor that some recent research has shown is that for students with the most significant disabilities, the biggest predictor of that student working in competitive integrated employment after they exit school is the parent expectation that they will go to work, that their son or daughter will go to work. So as we think about what we need to change, if we, I'm going to pick on Elsie O'Connor for a minute. I saw your name on the attendance list. So if you're a developmental disabilities case manager working with young adults and families, how do we start talking to families about what their role is, what expectations they can have for their son or daughter's life? For teachers, how do we explain that who applies for voc rehab services really has changed since the Voc Rehab Act was reauthorized in 2014? We really need to set the bar high and expect that students, all students, are going to have this opportunity of paid work in the community upon high school exit. And so to get there, they need to have work experience throughout high school, not just 1 or 2 experiences, but meaningful, individualized experiences. They need to begin early in high school, and they've got to be placed in that paid job, paid by the employer before they exit high school to have the best chance of working after graduation. Also, how do we work with families so that they can envision their son or daughter working in the community? We can alleviate their fears about what community employment looks like and what supports look like. And families, they need to be supported to access and navigate the world of adult services. Who do they apply to services with? How do they work together? Who does what? Ideally, we can figure out better strategies in Montana and in other states about how do all of these resources work together. Because especially these days, we don't have enough resources, for everybody that needs them. So we need to work more collaboratively, we need to work really efficiently, and we need to work smarter. And so again, what the report found was that communities where schools and agencies work together, supporting work experience, maybe the school does the coaching, maybe Voc Rehab or developmental disabilities or an employment agency do some of the job development. Maybe one does the transportation, the other does the travel training. But the point is, where these agencies work together, student outcomes in terms of leaving school with a paid job are better. So how do we look in our local communities about at Voc Rehab, developmental disabilities, workforce, schools, and mental health agencies? How do we all work together for the benefit of the student? So again, one of the main things that WIOA rings true for me is that our expectations need to be higher for students with the most significant disabilities, but students with all disabilities, in terms of, are they going to go to work after they exit high school? And again, we've got to get to families. How do we engage families? How do we support families? How do we give families information about if they have a son or daughter that they've raised for 18 years, but they've been told your son or daughter isn't ready to work in the community? How do we undo that information? How do we show them that it is possible and what it could look like, even if their son or daughter isn't, quote, competitive, in how fast they work or how much they produce? How do we introduce them to the concepts of negotiated employment and customized employment so they can see their child working in the community? Because when we think about it, for those of you who are parents of young children without disabilities, or maybe older children without disabilities, you didn't have to start saying, wow, okay, now my child's 16, so in their annual plan at school, we're going to start talking about transition. So this is the year we talk to them about work. Most of us, by the time we were 16, already had ideas for careers in our mind. We may have bombed out of a couple of our career interest areas already. We've probably gotten some money. We probably already have our own bank accounts. We've probably done either chores for money or something entrepreneurial. So if we think about our transition law, about when we start talking about the post-secondary outcomes of work to students with disabilities, 16 is way too late. So part of what I started looking around at is what's on the internet that guides chores for all kids. And this is a list of age-appropriate chores for kids at age 2 and 3. How do we get this information to parents of kids with disabilities? You know, for those of you who work mostly with transition age kids, you may not be the person that shares this information. But who is? Who works with those kids? How do we get the information to families earlier? How do we get people thinking that it's okay for kids with disabilities to have a bank account, to save money? And if this is a young person who's going to rely on supplemental security income or SSI, what are the rules around saving and earning money? And let's make sure families have the right information. And then how do we start talking to families? And I'm sharing the picture of my friend Natalia with her permission, but also to talk about the conversation we had the first day I met her. And she and her mom asked me for help thinking about, you know, transition goals and thinking through transition for this young woman. And the first day I got to go to her house was basically, it was the first day she had gone to high school. And so, you know, maybe this is the ideal time to start thinking about transition. And luckily with Natalia, her mom had already been thinking about the future, just didn't put it into terms or terminology of transition yet. But when I asked her mom, like, what's her day going to look like when she no longer goes to high school? There was kind of this blank look on her face. And, you know, that's a really hard question for families. And, you know, we start saying that maybe families, you know, they're not paying attention to transition, or they're not engaged, or they don't come to events that we invite them to or we think is going to be really helpful for them. We need to start working with families a whole lot earlier and helping them see what the process looks like and how starting early can really assist their student or their son or daughter to be more prepared and for their family to be more prepared. But when I started asking more questions about, well, will Natalia live out on her own? Will she have a job? How will she get to her job? Will she be married? How will she interact with friends? You could just see all the wheels spinning in her mom's head. And she's like, I don't know. And the reason that I used this photo with this story is that there's a picture of a clock and there's a picture of a time timer. And basically what Jan had said was, I can't even think of any of that yet. I just can't even see by the end of 4 years that Natalia will get herself up and out the door and on the school bus in time without me nagging her all the time. And I was like, okay, so what does it look like now? And she said, well, she has an alarm. She gets herself up. She goes through her routine. And as long as nobody interrupts it, she's fine. You know, she's out the door. But at the same time, I'm constantly reminding her, she has to hurry up. She has to hurry up. And so I asked Jen, I'm like, well, how's that going? And she's like, not well at all. She doesn't hurry up. And so we talked some more about the goal of getting up and out the door on your own. And so what we talked about was, instead of constantly reminding her that she needs to hurry up, let's give her concrete information about how much time she has. She's very good with listing out what she needs to do for her routine and getting it done. And so within the first month of high school, she was getting up and out the door on her own, and Jan was downstairs exercising. And years later, after graduation, she does live in her own home. Actually, her parents moved into a new home, and Natalia lives in her home. Sometimes she has housemates that live there with her. So they provide informal supports, just, you know, from other people living in your house. She has several jobs. She rides the bus all over Missoula. She's not married, as far as I know yet. But all of her outcomes are based on the family being able to dream a little bit. But they needed help. thinking about what was possible. And then they needed help thinking about what are those steps involved to get somebody close to those desired outcomes. And so basically this is my flow chart for IDEA. And this what the school's responsibility is in transition planning. So basically you start at the bottom left and you identify, what are the students' current levels of performance? And in terms of transition, those are your age-appropriate transition assessments. What are the person's skills and abilities now? And that helps you identify the top right, those measurable post-secondary goals. And between those two boxes, you need to look at what skills can we teach through classes and experiences and connections that improve the person's current levels of performance to achieve their measurable post-secondary goals. And if they can't do that whole activity or their strategy on their own, how do we come up with alternative strategies? Such as, for Natalia to use the bus independently, she doesn't need somebody to tell her when to get off. She memorizes those routes with no problem. Her speech isn't always understood by the bus driver. So she and her mom came up with different strategies for her to communicate with the bus driver. If he doesn't understand her speech, she just shows him a card that says where she's getting off. And then he helps stop the bus to get her there. So with thinking about, based on the current skills and where you want to be in the end, how do we prepare families and students for that end so they're as competent and prepared as possible? And I know this isn't just school teachers. This is where we want to look at who else in terms of community connections, in terms of it's not just the special ed teacher, but what part does the English teacher play? What part does the school counselor play in this transition? What part does Voc Rehab play now with some of their new activities around transition? What's the role of the DD case manager in all of this, or workforce? And how do you pull this all together? Who are those agencies that this student needs to connect with for long-term supports? Can they provide support now? What does that look like? How do schools and agencies work together? And what if the supports your son or daughter needs when they exit school, they aren't available for a while? Are there different ways to get those needs met? And so I have the term barter. I love bartering for things instead of using cash. So what if you don't have Medicaid waiver funding for job coach support? Is there a different way to get that support on the job while you're waiting for formal services? So again, like now that under WIOA, Voc Rehab and schools are mandated to collaborate together. That doesn't mean that schools no longer have responsibilities for the age-appropriate transition assessments for students, for determining their skills and abilities, their support needs. That's still part of what the school has to do under IDEA. The school has to identify the measurable post-school goals using those age-appropriate transition assessments and figure out what the student's strengths and preference, abilities, and support needs are. But this is where some of the new stuff comes in. If we're raising the bar really high and saying that students with significant disabilities should have the opportunity to try out work for pay in the community, and so they can make an informed choice, the age-appropriate transition assessments that we use need to focus on the glass half full mentality. Those assessments have to tell us what works for the student, where they're most able to participate based on environment or adaptations or modifications or technology. We need to, instead of identifying everything a student can't do, that's not going to help us see positive outcomes. We understand the student has needs, but where do they excel? What types of learning environments enable them to learn a skill more proficiently and competently? What kind of tasks could they offer an employer? And so thinking about what we're doing for age-appropriate transition assessments and how that information helps inform VR when we start looking at what the pre-employment transition services are for that student, that's how we all start working together. So I'm just going to scoot ahead. So again, like, how does, we talked about how we work with families to start thinking about bigger outcomes for students with disabilities, but how do we start talking with paraprofessionals in schools and teachers? And how do we start having these conversations with younger students and have them talk to us about what they want their life to look like after high school? And this is a young woman named Carly, who has also given her permission for us to share her photo and story. And Carly has always been incredibly outspoken about what she wants as a young woman. And so when she was younger, she basically, that picture illustrated she wanted to live in her own apartment. Like, she didn't want to live with her mom and her sister forever. And so eventually she said, I want to live in my own home. And so she and her mom figured it out. They really understood what Carly's support needs were, how she's somebody who needs help getting in and out of bed. She uses a communication device to communicate. So if she needed help in the middle of the night and she was home alone, things needed to be accessible to her. She needed to have her phone. She needed to have her communication device. She needed to make sure that they were accessible in case of an emergency. And the interesting thing, if you want to read her story, and I'm hoping my hot links work, here we go. So we go to, if you follow that link, basically it takes you to the Rural Institute Transition webpage and the Emerging Leader Stories. And these are stories that we have collected, and Kim Brown has been very influential in this, as well as all the members of the Consumer Advisory Council. But if you go down to housing and you click on Carlys Story, basically it talks about who Carly is. And it talks about, this is a young woman who really wanted to live on her own. And it was her community that started saying, oh no, if you can't get out of your bed on your own, then you're not safe to live in your own home. And so you should always live with somebody else. And so basically Carly and her family fought it and said, look, my house is right next to my mom's house. I have an emergency alert button. I have an intercom that's on during the night. We understand, and we have a strategy for me to ask for help when I need it. And so because she was so aware of her own needs and she had the skills to express her needs and her wants and how she did things to the community after probably a small barrier of the community, she does live on her own, or actually did. So the purpose of these emergent leader stories have been to be able to share these stories, these visions with other families. All the stories of people include stories of living, learning, recreating, or going to school in the community. And most of the stories are they're all folks with developmental disabilities. Most folks also have intellectual disabilities. So again, here we have Carly pushing the bar. She'd always told people that she wanted to be married. She was clear about that when she was a sophomore in high school. And so recently I Googled and saw this article with this beautiful picture with, obviously she is expressing like her preferences over hair color, but it's a great article and picture an announcement of her plans to get married. And here's, basically the journal article if you want to go see what the families put in the paper. And then thinking, and part of why I'm just pulling in all these random websites is, how do you as professionals go out and share these stories, these, I guess, these possibilities with families and students? Like, as you're thinking about how to offer information to students with disabilities about what's out there for transition possibilities, instead of just saying, well, this is what this agency offers, what we can do is look at, let's dream big. What's out there for everybody else around the country, around the world? What's possible? And if it doesn't exist yet in our community, how do we make it happen? So let me take you to, okay, we will get there. Basically, this is a Rethinking College video. And basically, there's been grant funding, the TIPSID grants, which is the transition to post-secondary for individuals with intellectual disabilities. And so this is a great trailer.
Question. Can you tell me about your college experience?
Sure. I came from a really small town. I loved it a lot. Really taught me a lot about life and life skills. Helped me come out of my shell.
College was great. It set me on the path that I'm on today. It took me to Peace Corps, and now it took me to a new job.
Oh, college was great. I had my career choice. I even met my wife there.
Who do you think should go to college?
I think everyone should go to college.
I think everybody should go to college.
Anybody that wants to.
What about people with intellectual disabilities?
What?
That's a big question.
I've never really thought about that.
So again, I'm just giving you like little quick, oh boy, little quick clippets of what's available at these various websites. And so this would be something that you could go back and look at more. But the Think College website is hosted by the Institute for Community Inclusion at UMass Boston. And it's a compilation of information on the TIPSID programs from around the country. It gives you information about financial aid as well as what's available and also what those programs look like. And in Missoula, we don't have a TIPSID grant or an established transition program. However, we've got the University of Montana, and we do have a lot of resources in this college town that are available because it's a college town. And so thinking about how to connect to those can be part of transition planning. And, you know, and just because a formal program doesn't exist doesn't mean that we can't access college or community. Here's another fun one. This is, you know, asking a question like, can somebody with autism, a label of autism, be a business owner? And I'm going to take you to this site, and it's up on YouTube, so you can share this with anybody, with families, with students, with other teachers. Okay, but this is the part that I really want to share with you. Joe is presenting at a conference, I believe in Maine, and it's how he describes himself is fascinating.
Ellen, are you able to increase the volume at all?
Oh, let me try.
Years ago, my parents told me the story of two young boys. One was a young boy with autism and Down syndrome. His IQ is 32. He has profound intellectual disabilities. His receptive and expressive language is that of a 3-year-old. He has minimal basic academic skills. Constant supervision is required. Time on task and completion of skills. Joseph is active and enjoys being with other people and making friends. He has a good memory for details. Joseph follows through on activities that are part of his daily routine. He spends time listening to music and working on the computer. Enjoys horseback riding and bowling. He loves his independence. Joseph is a strong swimmer. I figured out it's his name. Joseph Jerome Steppy. Joseph is all my family, friends, and the community know me. Jerome is not a professional report slavery. Now will you live with me through my presentation?
Okay, so I think he drives home the basically the whole thought about what we need to be doing for age-appropriate transition assessments for students with a more significant impact of disability. I think that last couple minutes describing how others see him, the professionals, and it's a whole list of deficits versus how his family and people who know him see him. I think if we're going to set the bar high and look at community employment for people with a significant impact of disability, we need to make sure that what we're using for assessments in school for age-appropriate transition assessments and how we're learning about somebody through work experience and time in the community through pre-employment transition services and also school-sponsored work experience, we've got to be looking at strategies that help us figure out what people can do, where they're at their best, how to support them to be most contributing. Because if we don't change the tools we've used in the past, which have only excluded people with a more significant disability, our post-school outcomes aren't going to change. So the other one I wanted to show with you, frequently we hear, well, this person's behavior isn't under control, they can't work in the community, or maybe they don't have the social skills yet, and so we keep thinking that people aren't ready and they need to go someplace so they get ready to work in the community. But when we look at the data about how effective some of the sheltered settings are, like the sheltered workshops, in getting people prepared to work in the community, what we found is that the data, especially from Ohio, is showing that students are more expensive when VR places them from a sheltered workshop to community employment, and they work less hours. So what we do know is that people with significant support needs can work in the community when we individualize employment for them. And so what we need to do during transition is learn about where people are at their best, how to support them at their best, and what environments work for them. So this is, oh, so sorry.
Are you listening?
Could you maybe tell us what we should be hearing, Ellen? Because it's too faint to hear.
Oh, that's amazing. Okay, so basically it is really loud music, and I'm sorry that you guys aren't hearing it because I was afraid that I was gonna blast your ears off. But basically it's music that's going on that accompanies Sam the dancing barista. And as the video progresses, his coworker is then dancing as well. And so instead of people saying, well, you need to get your movement under control before you go to work in the community, this young man is a pretty famous barista now. He's been on the Ellen DeGeneres show. He's been on several news programs. And again, it looked at what his gifts and interests were and really said, you know, maybe the community doesn't need him to get his dancing under control. And based on the, I guess, the feedback for Starbucks, he's bringing a lot to that business. And then this is another story I found on the internet about this young woman from Australia who is somebody who has a label of Down syndrome and basically wanted to be a model and is now a model, and not a model with just people with disabilities, but she walks down the catwalk in New York and in Paris, and this is her website. And so, you know, I think sometimes we feel like it's our role to tell people with disabilities that their goals or their ideas are not reasonable. But had this young woman listened to that, she wouldn't be pursuing modeling as her career, and she's quite successful. So again, I'm trying to pick stories that just get us thinking differently. And so this is a young man named Lance who I worked with years ago. And, you know, as we got to know him, like, we couldn't use assessments that identified, you know, what his skills were in terms of reading or writing or what he knew in math. We had to really figure out who he was by spending time with him and talking to people who knew him well. And what we discovered was that he was happiest when he could be moving. He loved to go for van rides. We were looking for a job where he could travel around an area, like an office area. So we were looking inside because he had a visual disability and some balance issues. And so we wanted him to have short, predictable interactions with people he knew. And so that's exactly, you know, and based on getting to know him, that's what we were looking for. What ended up getting developed was a business where he did deliveries for a bakery in town that also served sandwiches. And then he had a contract with GlaxoSmithKline, which earlier was called Corixa, in Hamilton, Montana, where he would do deliveries for the bakery for the employees. And initially he was paid by delivery fee, and the bakery figured out all the accounting for him because, you know, math wasn't a skill of his and it wasn't going to be something that he was going to learn and be able to do on his own. But the business was basically created around what he needed to participate and what would make him happy and what would really increase his contribution. And so again, like, especially in some of our rural areas of Montana, thinking about what's something we can offer for pay. And so, I'm sorry, we are kind of a bit behind schedule, but I want to get to some of the interesting stuff in here. What's, you know, one of the things that's really pushing states to look at who's employable are the Employment First initiatives. And our state does have some wording around Employment First, and it's on our Developmental Disabilities Program website. But what the Employment First movement is about is that it gives public funding, it gives priority of public funding to accessing paid community employment as the preferred choice of employment for people with disabilities. And this movement started most strongly within the developmental disabilities field, but states who are adopting employment first philosophy and then language and then legislation have opened this up to folks with mental health issues. There's Providence, Rhode Island is the first school district who has actually created an employment first policy for students in special ed. That's huge. Our state doesn't have legislation around employment first yet, but maybe someday we will. But basically our state says that folks with developmental disabilities should have the choice of working in the community. And now there's other laws that back that up, such as the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. And basically what this law does, it reauthorizes vocational rehabilitation and defines what services they offer and who they serve and when they serve. And that's changed since 2014. And so a lot of the assumptions we have about who can get served under voc rehab is really different now that this law has passed. Anybody with a disability, regardless of the severity of the disability, should be accessing voc rehab. And you don't need to formally apply in order to get the pre-employment transition services. And we're going to talk more about specifically what's available in Montana during the next webinar. But what this national legislation really emphasizes is that the preferred outcome is paid community employment. Minimum or prevailing wage, working alongside people without disabilities, and access to the same benefits and room for advancement. And that's, the guy on the left is somebody in a shirt and a tie working at a computer, versus the group of folks on the right is a group of people with developmental disabilities, most likely, doing piecework where they would get paid sub-minimum wage and they would be paid based on what their performance was. And so again, we've talked about what competitive integrated work is, but the three main pieces are that it's minimum wage or above at a location where the employee interacts with other people who don't have disabilities to the same extent of someone in a comparable position. Meaning, if you're somebody who is out working as a groundskeeper, your level of integration as a person with a disability would be the same as somebody without a disability working in that same type of job. And there's opportunities for advancement. And so, like I said before, we know there's research that's been done for years about people with significant impact of disability accessing paid employment in the community. We know that those strategies to get there need to be individualized and intense, and for a significant or an adequate length of time for that to be successful. But part of what I see the role of transition is identifying what supports somebody needs so that we can be creative about how those supports are provided, giving people a variety of work experiences that are individualized so that they can participate, so they can contribute, so they can feel what work feels like, and so their families can also see them working. And so this is a piece of information from the Department of Justice and their guidance on integration according to the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I'm going to share with you some other case studies on that, but what they're saying is that people with disabilities in or at risk of entering segregated employment settings must have the opportunity to make an informed decision about whether or not they want to work in an integrated employment setting. So anybody who we're assuming is headed to a sheltered work setting because we think that's the only thing available to them, or because they or their families saying they want that, basically what the U.S. Department of Justice is saying is that unless we offer that person the opportunity to make an informed choice, meaning they experience community integrated employment as well as sheltered, then we're putting them at unnecessary risk of segregation. And what's been happening is that the Department of Justice has been suing states for unnecessarily putting people at risk of segregation, and basically saying that if people are headed into sheltered settings without that opportunity that to make an informed choice, then that's a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so, you know, I like to use Kelsey as an example about, like, am I really talking about people with significant disabilities? And I most certainly am. And part of Kelsey's transition experience was she did have some community-based experience, and it had to be very individualized for her to even participate. We had to look at what her conditions for success were. She had to have tasks that she could operate using some sort of switch. Those tasks had to benefit an employer. She needed a space that was accessible for her pretty large electronic wheelchair, as well as her support person. She needed somebody with her to help connect her devices to the switches, and those would either be communication devices or devices that operated equipment for her tasks. We also needed a place within certain proximity to the school, and it had to be in the morning because that's when her health was most stable. And initially when she started, because of her medical frailness, she needed a task and a job setting where she could work for 15 minutes, take a 15-minute break, and then go back for another 15 minutes. And that's, you know, and all of this had to be very individualized for her to even try out competitive integrated employment, to see what it was like to work in the community. So just because somebody can't compete doesn't mean they can't work for real pay in the community. It just means that they need a more individualized strategy, such as customized employment. So, and for those of you who have participated in some of our transition webinars for over the years, we've talked about customized employment for a long time, and we've talked about discovery. It wasn't until 2014, with the reauthorization of the Rehabilitation Act under WIOA, that customized employment was written into the law. Now there's the definition about what customized employment is, and VR agencies need to offer that as a service. That doesn't mean that it's readily available all over the country yet. Each state is figuring out how to build capacity of the people that provide those services, figuring out who gets those services based on who needs them, what the fee structure is. And so that's something still in Montana we're figuring out, but it's very similar to the other states in the country. The other directive under WIOA is that VR now needs to spend 15% of their budget on these pre-employment transition services for students with disabilities. And these services focus on preparing people to work, people with disabilities. And the whole idea is that if schools and VR collaborate and start early, those post-school outcomes, meaning there's going to be more kids with disabilities going to work, real work in the community after high school. So in our state, students can get pre-employment transition services, or pre-ETs, as young as 14, as long as they're enrolled in high school. And the students that are eligible are students with an IEP, a 504 plan, or they're potentially eligible for VR, meaning that they would be eligible for an IEP or 504 plan but don't have it yet. And so how this impacts employment services for students is that students can get access to VR expertise and services a whole lot earlier. They don't have to wait until that last year of high school. And now there's a mandate for voc rehab and schools to work together. And there's a state memorandum of understanding of how this is going to work. And it's all focused on the preferred outcome is competitive integrated employment. And we have basically customized employment in the law now. So there's another big piece of WIOA, and that's Section 511. So basically, this goes back, and it's very much in line with the Department of Justice, saying that if people aren't given an informed choice, they are unnecessarily segregated, and that's against the law under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Okay, so when we look at Section 511 of WIOA, it says really similar things. So for youth with disabilities, prior to being placed in sub-minimum wage employment, so a sheltered setting where they're working for piece rate and receiving sub-minimum wage, as of 2016, this went into enforcement. Anybody who's 24 or under has to have had pre-employment transition services from their public VR agency or transition services under IDEA from their school. They have had to be referred and either determined ineligible for VR services or accepted for VR services but not achieving a paid employment outcome. They need to receive career counseling, information and referrals from VR to programs such as your community employment vendors who would help them experience competitive integrated employment. So all that needs to happen before a sheltered workshop is allowed by the Department of Labor, who's enforcing this, to let you in the door. That's very different. The other piece that WIOA prevents is that schools can no longer, or actually this is Department of Justice, schools can no longer say, okay, this is a person who's going to end up in a sheltered workshop because they don't have the skills to work in the community. So for transition, we're going to have them attend the sheltered workshop. That's no longer legal. That's unnecessary segregation. Okay, so as WIOA directs school and VR to work together, again, VR doesn't take over what the schools are supposed to be doing under IDEA in terms of transition services. The pre-employment transition services augment what a school has previously provided for career preparation. And there's 5 areas that are mandated. And I'm probably going to just give you a link to this because we're going to be running out of time soon here. So the other piece that is coming into play in terms of laws is the Medicaid home and community-based settings final rules that were rewritten in 2014. And basically what this says is that people who are receiving services that are home and community-based services but funded by Medicaid. So what that means is services that are offered in the home or in the community, and the waiver is that this person has the level of support that would potentially need to be provided in an institution, but instead of being provided in an institution, the waiver says that service can be provided in home and community-based settings instead. So this might refer to a group home or an intensive care facility, or it could also apply to a rehabilitation program. So where people aren't necessarily focused on work, they might be focused on accessing community instead. But basically what these final settings rules are that even if somebody's not focusing on work, that folks need to have a lot of choice and in their services, and they need to have access to the community. And so it's not clear how group homes or rehabilitation centers are going to be coming into compliance with this, but people need to be able to choose their schedule. They need to be able to have access to the community and integrated activities. In some states, what the rehabilitation centers are looking at doing is asking if they could focus on work preparation activities, Right now, most of the waivers don't allow that for a day habilitation program. Okay, so the sticky part of WIOA is that if a student is transitioning from school to a day habilitation program, WIOA doesn't say that's a problem. However, the U.S. Department of Justice says the person needs to be able to make an informed choice. And if folks are being unnecessarily segregated in their services, then that's a violation of the ADA. So again, it's kind of the perfect storm of all these things coming into play at the same time as WIOA. Okay, the final piece is the integration mandate of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so the U.S. Department of Justice sued the state of Oregon, as well as the state of Rhode Island and the city of Providence. And basically what those court cases determined is that the public entities are required to administer services, programs, and activities in the most integrated setting appropriate to the needs of the individuals with disabilities. So that means if a public school is serving their students in a setting that resembles a sheltered workshop, and they're unnecessarily segregating people and preparing them for a segregated setting, that was found to be not in compliance of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so the most integrated setting is a setting that enables individuals with disabilities to interact with people without disabilities. And so again, like the state of Oregon had developed a lot of provider-owned businesses, and they were found to not be in compliance with the ADA. So even though the state started paying people minimum wage in those settings, they were still segregated settings. If it was predominantly a business run by people with disabilities, even though it was open to the public. And so this is something to be aware of, because I think a lot of it's still happening because people, they don't understand the different options for people with more significant disabilities. So for more information about the lawsuits and what's happened as a result, you know, basically Rhode Island and Oregon, the states have totally changed what's available for transition students. In Oregon, transition students for the next couple years have entitled access to developmental disability waiver funding to access customized employment and supported employment. Students are getting individualized vocational plans through Voc Rehab as they're still in school. The pipeline from the City of Providence School District to the sheltered workshop no longer exists. So there's some really interesting things that are happening as a result of those lawsuits. And states are looking at those to see what's happening in their state. So in terms of, you know, where does this leave education? A school may be seen as putting students at risk of institutionalization and segregation if they are training students in tasks similar to those performed in a sheltered workshop. And I've had conversations in the past years where I know schools are doing this because they're not sure what else to prepare students for. So for those of us who are invested enough in transition to better outcomes, how do we get this information out to schools and to teachers and to families that we should be looking at discovery for students with a more significant impact of disabilities? How do we figure out what they could do in the community rather than going to sheltered workshops and saying, oh, well, this is the kind of things they assemble there, so let's bring this back to our school. Because if the Department of Justice comes to Montana, they would state that that's illegal. And so this is the school in Providence that was sued, and there's articles here at this website if you care to go look at it to see what they've done instead. And so the services and the outcomes are much, much improved based on the lawsuits, although it cost states a lot of, it was painful, it cost them a lot of money. It probably wasn't the preferred way to make systems change. So I'm going to stop here and ask for questions, and I apologize that I didn't stop earlier to try that.
Okay, so if anyone has questions for Ellen, now's the time to go ahead and type those into your questions box. And if you don't see that, look for the orange arrow, or excuse me, the white arrow inside of the orange box at the upper right-hand side of your screen. If you click on that, it should open the dialog box where you can type in questions if you have them. And Ellen, the first one isn't so much a question, it was an answer from Elsie back when you singled her out and asked her, and she said, invite us to the IEP. So don't know if you want to say anything more about that.
Excellent. Yeah. And so, I'm not sure that schools always know which of their students with disabilities has developmental disability services already. And so, figuring out, like, how do we make sure that that IEP team knows to invite DD services or the case manager? How does the family know that they should ask the school to go ahead and invite that person? Yeah, because I think having Elsie at your IEP meeting would be a great addition.
Okay, thank you. And the next question is, so am I to understand that the WIOA is trying to deter sheltered workshops or trying to deter putting that on the IEPs?
WIOA basically is saying that people need to have an informed choice before they can access a sheltered workshop. So right now, and this is what's going on in the state of Minnesota, if somebody has, as a post-school or post-secondary outcome, attend the sheltered workshop, what the VR counselors are doing is they're meeting with teachers to find out who is slated to go directly into a sheltered workshop. And then basically it's VR's responsibility to get in there and provide career counseling about what are your choices. And in Minnesota, they're doing a pilot program and saying, let's offer discovery to those students whose families or whose school or who themselves think that they can't work in the community, and let's help them think about employment differently. And as long as that student has had career counseling, they've had service from VR, they've had the opportunity to look at community integrated employment, and that documentation goes with them to that sheltered workshop, it is legal for them to then enter the sheltered workshop. So basically the law isn't saying we're shutting workshops down. The law is saying that you need to be offered an informed choice. And the only way to make an informed choice, and this is a great quote from Jim Marks, who was our past VR director, or not pre-EDS director, Employment and Transition Services director, he was saying, how can you make an informed choice if you've only tried one? You can't choose between two if you only experience one. So that's what the point of the law is. Okay, so WIOA doesn't say we're going to close down workshops. It's just saying that you can't have a direct channel to a workshop without trying community integrated employment.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next question. How do I encourage a young man with autism to get a job? He is very capable and plans to attend college next fall. He has been out of school almost a year and hasn't left the sofa. His mother and I have both tried.
Wow. I'd hope that you could find something he needed money for. or some way to incentivize them. It's hard when people have gotten the message that sitting on the couch is okay, even if that wasn't the family's intent. Yeah, I'd figure out, is there anything that would motivate him, get him interested in doing something off the couch and turning that into tasks for pay. So I'd be interested to see, okay, so he's going to college. What's he going to college for? Because typically we go to college to learn skills that will apply to jobs. So yeah, that sounds challenging, but I'd start with figuring out like what motivates this person, what's interesting to them, and try to pursue that route.
Okay. In Florida, we have schools still putting that as the post-high school goal. We have Discovery Now, but it's just getting going. And this is referring back to the sheltered workshops, I'm sorry. So in Florida, we still have schools still putting that as the post-high school goal. We have Discovery Now, but it's just getting going. Also here in Florida, we tell families of children with autism to register with our DD department as soon as possible, as we have a 12-year wait list. People who wait till high school to register for DD don't get services.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, basically, the Department of Labor is enforcing. They're the arm of the law that enforces whether or not students, or not students, but anybody 24 and under has entered a sheltered workshop since July of 2016 without previously having pre-ETS and transition services and tried competitive integrated employment. And so basically, it's illegal now for sheltered workshops to let somebody in unless that student has documentation that they've had these other experiences and they're choosing sheltered work. So I think getting that information to families that this is the federal law now. This isn't just the school district saying you want to try something new and fancy. This is the law. They can't let you in. The family could choose to have their son or daughter sit at home until they're 25, and then they could go into a sheltered workshop if they have the funding. But unless there's documentation, that provider would be found in violation of the law. I think the bigger issue is, do families still think that's the only option? And the other piece is, are the providers ready to help students with autism and other barriers or other challenges, not barriers, but challenges to access employment? Because the same competitive strategies aren't going to be working for the folks who people still think can't work in the community.
Okay, thank you. And in response to your question about the young man with autism who plans to attend college next fall, the program that he'll be studying is graphic arts, in case that changes your answer in any way or allows you to expand on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see, okay, even doing some job shadows out there. Because he's no longer a student right now, he's probably, I'm talking as I'm thinking, he wouldn't be eligible for pre-employment transition services until he became a student in college. But if he had any source of services or an open VR case right now, it would be great for him to get to go do some job shadows around computers and graphic arts, and even entice him into trying out some tasks that would, serve as an internship, but also give him some work experience around computers and strengthen his skills that he's also going to, strengthen by going to college.
Okay, thank you. Next question. My son started his own business after graduating high school. He deals with autism. We want to provide opportunities to other families with young adults with different abilities to develop vocational skills. What's the most effective way to network?
And I'm starting to think that this is a parent I need to connect with and have been delinquent about it. one thing I'm thinking is that it's the time for our state to tap into families that want to help other families. And how could we build a family coalition and figure out how to support them? And I talked with another mom about this, about doing like a Families for Employment coalition, like who's available in our state to support the coordination of that, and then also to give information and maybe help do some of the development for the families, but the families run it and own it. The other thing I'm thinking is that the transition conference is coming up. It's going to be in Great Falls next November, and having put together a family panel about how they've created their post-school outcomes for their son or daughter, I think would be great. So I have been thinking about this, and I think especially in states where, and for those of you who are calling in from Florida, you don't realize Montana right now is in a really bad budget crisis. And so we're going to have to get pretty creative to increase employment outcomes for students with disabilities right now. But I think empowering families and educating families would be a great place to start.
And your response sort of flows right into the next question. This sounds great, but in reality right now, with VR's current budget situation in Montana, young people are just being placed on a wait list for an undetermined period of time. This wait list continues to grow, and no movement from VR is foreseen in the near future. What are some options that families can utilize while they're waiting?
You know, I think we're going to talk about some of those options in the next webinar. But I think this is, you know, right now there should not be a waiting list for pre-employment transition services. However, if people have waited, or the timing was such that a student just exited before pre-ETs got going, then we have a big problem. Because yeah, there's, in our state, it's all categories closed right now for Voc Rehab. But Voc Rehab is still funding pre-employment transition services. So I think one area is looking at bringing the communities together, and I think the independent living centers who are facilitating the transition community councils or the regional councils would be a good place to start, to say this is our community need. How do we work together to try and come up with some solutions? Because it's a community issue as well as a person with a disability issue. And yeah, our climate right now in Montana is dire. We've got to start earlier if we want kids to be exiting into jobs, especially kids with ongoing support needs. And so I think we'll look at, are people tapping into Social Security work incentives? Are people using the ABLE accounts? Are people looking at unpaid supports? What would that look like? How could you coordinate that? And then how are people starting early as possible in school, so they need fewer, or they're less reliant on formal agencies when they exit, because it may not be available for a while, which is really unfortunate.
Okay. And we don't have any other questions right now. While we give another minute or two to see if more come in, do you mind advancing to the next slide, Ellen, just as
I can do
your
that.
wrap-up remarks? And then I have a few sort of housekeeping things when you're finished. Last call for questions from anyone out there in the audience. Do you have any wrap-up remarks that you'd like to make, Ellen, before I do my final housekeeping?
No, I think, I guess the one remark I have is that if there's specific resources that you're in need of or want to share, please, indicate that in your surveys that Kim will send you. I think it's automatically generated at the end of this training. And we will try and incorporate that into the next webinar. But like I said, the next webinar, we're looking for anything that's available in Montana that we can share with you. and resources particular to this state.
Great, thank you. And as Ellen mentioned, a short survey will pop up when you sign out of the webinar today, and we really ask that you take a few minutes to complete the survey questions. I think we just have 8 of them, and there is a spot where you can put in other webinar topics that you would like to see addressed in the future. The next webinar is Transition from School to a Full Adult Life Part 2, and that will be held on April 10th from 1 until 2:30 Mountain Time. The flyer and registration for that will go out later this afternoon or this evening. So if you're interested, be sure to register. If you attended today's session, that does not mean that you're automatically registered for Part 2, so please sign up and attend the April 10th session. The recording for today's webinar will be posted to the training archives page, and I put the webinar URL or website address, the archives URL in your chat box. It should be up toward the beginning of your chat box. It's the Transition and Employment Projects page if you can't find that for some reason, and that should be posted in a week or so. I would like to thank Ellen for her fabulous presentation today and the great information that you shared with us, Ellen, and thanks to all of our audience members for taking time out of your busy day to attend. Have a great rest of your afternoon and week, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.